nervous about the election, right? Well, I'm really happy for our event tonight that we have something productive to do instead of just wait for returns to come in, which won't be in for a little while anyway. And I'm really proud to announce all of these people that are our wonderful panel on stage. I love politics so much. My first real job was in Washington, D.C., and my second job was in Austin, Texas, working in the capitals in those respective cities. And I was as important as a staple in one of them and as important as a stapler in the other one. But it was a fun experience and something that showed me that there's so much creativity and innovation that happens in the world of politics that we frequently don't appreciate because we get caught up in so many other things. And getting the different perspectives to kind of come alive when we're thinking about our political selves is something that tonight's event is all about. And I want to introduce each one of the people that's going to be on stage, and then our wonderful collaborator from the University of Arizona, Ted McPlouffe, who I've had the pleasure to know for many years, and Dr. John White, who's going to moderate tonight from our College of Education. But before any of that, let me just kind of give you a quick overview of what's happening with that note card that you were given. Because tonight's event is meant to be interactive. Usually in these sorts of talks, you hear from some expert, you hear from somebody who has something that they want to tell you about how the world is. And so much of what the discourse series in politics is about, and what we hope to bring to this, is about more of a sharing of perspectives. And in that, we're going to hear not necessarily a lecture, but we're going to hear from student voices to basically hear what does Gen Z think of elections, education, identity, the intersection of those different fields, and how does that shape your view on the political future of this country and its effect on the world. So on that card, I want you each to think over the next half hour or so about something that you dread about our political future, and then something that gives you hope. One of those couple of things, okay? You don't have to write something right now, just keep that in mind. And then on the flip side of the note card, I want you to think about how that might lead you to ask a question to one of the people up on stage tonight. And then we can have more of a back and forth. This is about sharing the perspectives of our student panel, but also about hearing from you about what's meaningful about our political future that we share collectively. So, having said all that, I'd like to first introduce the students from the University of Arizona. Ananya Singhi, if you could wave. She's a marketing and economics major at the University of Arizona and an Eller Rising Star in marketing. And with leadership roles in student organizations like the Women in Economics Club and the South Asian Student Association, she has great interest in academic freedom and campus speech. And as a participant in the Regents Cup, Ananya offers a nuanced perspective on the legal and cultural dynamics of campus expression. And we also have Andrew Pomgratz. He is a PPEL and economics major at the University of Arizona, and that's politics, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy. Politics, philosophy, economics, and law. And he has minors in international business and Spanish. And is a project analyst with the student engagement team in the W.A. Franke Honors College and a clerk for the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's also co-organized Hack Arizona and serves as a debater for the Regents Cup and a panelist for the UA Discourse Series. And then on the UNF front, we have Ali Jimenez, who grew up all over the East Coast, including Canada at one time, and is majored in child psychology with double minors in creative writing and film. They enjoy falling off of their skateboard and watching movies with friends. We have David Rodebaum, who grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, in the metro area there, and is majoring in international business and finance and enjoys hiking with his family and friends. We have Eliza Maisel, who grew up in Gulf Breeze, Florida, but as a military kid spent time in Michigan and Georgia as well. And she's majoring in biology with a concentration in coastal environmental science and hopes to pursue a career in conservation. And she enjoys being outside and exercising. And we have Valentina Bonilla, who grew up in Venezuela, but moved to Colombia due to the turbulent political climate and majors in physics and hopes to be a researcher in the future. She likes to dance, play with her puck Kobe, and get involved in student organizations in her free time. If y'all can give them a round of applause. Different regional, interdisciplinary, different majors, different career paths, all up on stage here to represent the diversity that is Gen Z. And then we have our guest moderator, Dr. John White from the College of Education. Dr. White is a professor in the College of Education, is currently the senior faculty fellow for the provost at UNF. Recently, he's been both the president of UNF's Faculty Association, as well as its faculty union, which is where I first got to know John. He's volunteered on half a dozen congressional and presidential campaigns for decades, and his research in the field of education focuses on school reform, sociolinguistics, and student success, and more specifically is currently geared around curriculum, power, and ideology in the UK and the US. And then the last intro that I have here for you is my friend, Professor Ted McClough, who's a principal lecturer at the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. His work has appeared in esteemed journals such as the Kenyon Review, Diagram, and Bellevue, and he's been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and the Best of the Net Award. And for the last several years, he's directed the UA Discourse Series, coordinating this series crisscrossing the country to put students in dialogue with others, sharing their perspectives on socio-political topics that mean the most to college students. And I've been fortunate to know him for over a decade, and I'm always excited to see what he's going to build next. So with that, let me turn it over to Ted McClough.
Thanks, Will. I was going to stand behind the podium, but I'm looking at the live stream and realizing I'm way too short for the podium for the live stream to see me. So just very quickly, I don't want to kind of overwhelm everybody with introductions. I do want to get to the panel, but I did just want to introduce the UA debates, the UA Discourse Series, and what we do. It's probably relevant to point out that the idea for the UA Discourse Series began the day after the 2016 election. I teach debate in my courses, and everyone was feeling a little bit sort of stressed out from the 2016 election, and I remember going into my class the next day, watching my students prepare the debate that they had done, and I watched them argue with each other, and I went, why are these people so much better at doing this than the candidates who we've been watching and the people in the media who have been trying to sort of analyze all this stuff? And I realized that my favorite people, as is always the case, to interact with and to hear from are my students, the college students, who are always incredibly thoughtful and have great stuff to say. So that's why we do this. We go around to different colleges across the country to try to get these panels together to elevate student voices, hear what it is that y'all have to think. And of course, tonight is election night. You're probably going to be checking your phones every now and then to watch the election returns come in. So thank you for being here at a time when I'm sure that you probably have other things that are on your mind, but hopefully we'll be talking about exactly what's on your mind. So very quickly, I just want to go through the run of show this evening. So we're going to hear from our student panelists, moderated by John. Thank you, John, for doing this. For about half an hour, we're going to sort of hear what it is that our student panelists who have been talking about this stuff with us week by week in preparation for tonight. We're going to hear what they have to say on the issue of what are the issues that concern college students the most when it comes to the election, what are the issues that get you out to vote, what are the issues that sort of make you feel a little bit despairing and maybe keep you from deciding to vote. We're going to hear from them for about half an hour. After that, we're going to have a very brief 5-minute intermission, although it's not really an intermission because all of you hopefully will be working with your groups to be able to figure out whether the questions that are on your note cards are also questions that are shared by everybody else. And if those questions are ones that you feel as though you'd like to share, right after that intermission, we're going to have a Q&A where you can ask those questions of our panelists, hear what they have to say. Hopefully your questions are actual questions. I always like to remind audiences, questions are things that end in a question mark. So make sure that you have something to ask our panelists. And we'll take about a half an hour worth of Q&A after that. And then you are free to come up and bombard our panelists afterwards with whatever questions that you have. I think there's other stuff in preparation for your classes and things like that. But that is going to be the whole entire night. So that said, I don't want to take any more time away from this excellent panel. So John, go ahead and take it away. Let's give one last round of applause for our panelists.
What you, as college students, Gen Z, think there are the main ideas of the election? Or what do you think is the headline of this election? And the preface to that is, I'm 57 years old, and I get my news and information from certain sources. That's often different for different people, different generations, and different ethnicities, backgrounds, etc. So the question is, what do you think are going to be the major headlines of this election, and ideally what people will be talking about.
So, speaking from a Gen Z perspective, I think that this election is going to be remembered as the election of a lifetime because just so much feels at stake. Gen Z is a younger generation, and for many of us, this is the first election that we're voting in. So, specifically for Gen Z, it feels like their very identities are on the line. The right to be themselves is on the line. Not to get too much into the policies of either candidate, just the LGBT community, women, and a lot of minorities across the Gen Z population have their rights threatened by the outcome of this election, which is why I feel there's so much at stake and it's going to be remembered like that.
Yeah, I think when we talk about elections, everything looks like really divided. But I feel like as students, and me personally, I feel like we all want simple things, and that is having equal voices, having representation, having a fair living cost, and affordable education. So I feel like even though it feels very divisive, I think it's like very simple things that we all care about. And also one thing that the history will remember for me would be representation, and I feel this is the time where women can represent, and it would be a history if you have a chance.
So almost every presidential election, one side or both sides pit each other as the enemy, and in this case, the enemy of democracy, the enemy of the future of this country. What do you think separates this election? Like you mentioned, it's the critical election. What do you think separates this election from the one 4 years ago, or the one 8 years ago, or 12 years ago when you were all toddlers? I mean, what makes it so critical compared to past elections?
So I think that the main difference there is uniquely unlike any other election in the past. Both sides believe that there's an existential crisis, that they need to go out and hit the polls to safeguard democracy, whether they're right or wrong. That there's genuine fear that your way of life is going to be forever changed by this election. And I think that that's a unique challenge again that we've never had before in the country.
I also think that the stakes are just a lot higher with the results themselves this election because following the wake of January 6th, we legitimately don't know what the response will be if one party or the other wins. Even though there's kind of that doomsday scenario, it could lead to actual violence this election.
I'll say one specific difference to get into specific policy would be the overturn of Roe v. Wade. This election specifically is going to have consequences due to that. That in the past, there were ideals on either side of the argument, but there was no real concrete way to change the actual policies within the federal government and within states. And now that we see that and we talk about a federal abortion ban or making abortion legal on a federal level again, that is a big difference that has just never come up in any election. And I think for the majority of America, either way, it is a huge issue and something especially that Gen Z is interested in and cares about.
Or maybe it is not as important, maybe all the elections were equally important, and we are feeling the crisis because this is the first time we are voting, and maybe Gen Z is being targeted like that. And so maybe choosing a leader has always been important, and every election is marketed as the most important elections because they're trying to target the new voters.
I would say that every election is kind of portrayed that way or framed that way, but the rhetoric has gone up and up and up to the point where we haven't seen it before. And of course, it's always cumulative, so we don't know what's going to happen 4 years from now, but I think the rhetoric has gotten so excessively fueled and charged that it feels different now than it did before. So what are you going to say?
I wanted to follow up what Eliza was saying because I think it adds up to the feeling that your life is at risk because at least for half of the population that's the case, because we have heard from states which have very strict laws against abortion that there have been countless deaths that could have been avoided but ended up happening because of women not being able to receive the medical care that they needed on time due to these laws. So, at least for women, the stance that the administration that gets elected today defines whether or not they will be able to get life-saving treatment. So I think that adds a lot to the stakes of this election.
A related question is, but might be somewhat related. Where is it that your generation is getting their information? In other words, I told this story before. In my generation, there were 3 major networks, if you didn't include PBS, and each major network had nightly news. And the nightly news was carried on all the networks. The newspapers had the news. But in each organization, there was an editor. And the editor was the gatekeeper of truth in many ways. In other words, you came to my, if you're a journalist and you came to me as the editor, I'd want you to make sure you back up all the sources, back up the information from multiple sources, etc. We know the news landscape is changing. Where is it that young people today get their information? And when you get your information, what are you doing to specifically weigh the possible truths and myths in that information?
I think it's an excellent question, John, and it's really reflective of the fact that we receive so much information on so many different topics almost daily. I feel like it's so hard sometimes just to parse through everything because it feels like every 10 minutes something new is happening, and if you're not keeping up with the wave, then it's, you're missing out. I personally get my news from more traditional sources. I'm more of kind of a classic news junkie. I've got subscriptions to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post through my student status at the University of Arizona. And I would think maybe some of my colleagues here too probably have similar subscriptions, student or student status. But I don't know if that's reflective of other Gen Z, and I'd like to hear from my fellow panelists on that.
I mean, I learned that Trump got shot on Twitter. I mean, I do think that the thing about social media is it's so attractive as a news source because it's instant, you're already there, all your friends can talk about it, but intentionally seeking after news sources instead of kind of passively consuming it is something that I think our generation really needs to prioritize.
I think I get my news from social media, but even on social media there are sources that can be reliable. I follow Wall Street Journal, Economic Times, and I feel like that helps me consume reliable information, even though it's coming from social media, because that's where I spend most of my time. But that helps me spend my time wisely too.
I'm not gonna lie, I also get most of my news from social media. Preparing for this panel, I definitely went into more reliable sources to say so, like the New York Times, podcasts, etc. I even downloaded, some of you may have heard about this, but there's this website called Round News which shows you different articles from both sides of the political spectrum so that you can check your sources and get out of your bubble, because when you're only looking at your social media, then your algorithm will automatically give you content that aligns with your perspective, so you can get trapped in these bubbles thinking, oh, everyone thinks the same as I do. So that's how I've been trying to get out of that bias. But as Andy was saying, I don't think this is representative of Gen Z, and most of us, like me before preparing for this panel, only get our sources from social media. And it's also what's the most impactful, because even though there may be some sources that will give you the correct information, that won't catch your attention the way some spectacular headline will do. And that's usually what sticks and what I think has been shaping Gen Z political views for these elections specifically.
I think it's a great point. It sounds like an excellent website. I think the real danger is having, like what you said, the algorithms that determine kind of your echo chamber, but that's kind of a glass echo chamber where you're not really, you can think that you're consuming sources from multiple sides. So you're like, oh, it's not just one website that I confirm this, but multiple. And that I have like a really well-informed opinion from multiple different sources, but that could just be not the case. So having a diverse set of opinions where you really reach outside the box and kind of looking at all the different sides, talking to different people is super, super important.
So what I'm hearing is, I'm getting the notion that even with social media, you're being critical consumers. In other words, you're not passively in reading and saying you're an active reader. You're taking information and critically thinking about it, right? So one of my questions is, where and how does your generation learn to think critically? And I mean that in all seriousness, because we know from cultural reproduction theory that children are brought up in their parents' homes where they learn the ideology of their parents. They go to churches where they learn their parents' religion. They go to schools that often are microcosms of their society. And what I'm wondering is it college or is it something more that gets you to engage in thinking critically about not just the issues that are out there, but the things that you're taught by your parents, for instance, so that you don't necessarily vote like mom and dad do?
I really think for me, it comes back to social media. There's a lot of caveats to social media, and you do have to consume it critically. But I have greatly moved away from the views of my parents, and a lot of that perspective started with the resources I had of having my phone and being able to look stuff up online. I would be influenced by people at my school, but then I would see more things online. I wouldn't necessarily take that at face value. I've always been very stubborn. So just listening to what my friends say didn't always sway my beliefs or opinions, but going online and being able to see so many different perspectives, even though sometimes we do talk about being in an echo chamber, it is also a great place to find new perspectives and learn new information that you might not have had inside of where you live, where you grew up, what religion you were from.
Okay, so you guys heard that I'm from Alabama, and of course all of you know that if hell freezes over, Alabama's still going to go Republican in this election. So you really hear a lot of that sort of side, and I'm not saying that it doesn't happen other places, on a different side. But sort of this idea that, of course, internet really helps, watching videos where you're challenged, where your views really get challenged with facts, and at school where teachers will really challenge you, be like, why do you hold that opinion? Is it just something that your parents said to you? And stuff like that, where I think it's really, really, really important to break out of that, where we're constantly in this rut, and we've got to look outside this spectrum over there.
I think for Gen Z, breaking out of that kind of hereditary belief definitely starts at school. At least for me, this is not my experience in America. This is from when I was back in Colombia. But there's one party or one candidate that the section of the community that I was part of tends to lean for. And I saw that in school. I saw that in my parents. But there was one point where I started meeting people from a different section of the community, to say so, who went to public universities, or that experienced at face value what the politics from this party was going through. And that really opened my eyes to the spectrum that is out there, that I didn't have to believe exactly what my parents believe. And this got reinforced by one assignment that I had in high school, where we all had to write a paper about one of the presidential candidates, and I chose the candidate that wasn't the one that all my classmates were supporting, that my parents were supporting, and I looked into these policies, and that made me really realize, then I think I believe something different from other people, and I can back it up. And that experience comes back now, I think, into my research and opinions.
And I feel that critical thinking, like my fellow panelists have said, really comes from so many different sources. And at least for me personally too, I've kind of seen the damage that not being aware of all these different sources can do to your mental health, can do to the way in which you view the world. I'm sure many of us have people that we know in our lives much only read one side or the other, don't really pay attention to different perspectives, and you know, it can be very damaging for how they view the world. I've got plenty of people in my life that I know that do that, and they are very pessimistic and don't kind of believe in the better parts of humanity, and that can be hard. It can be hard when we're constantly getting this bad news bias every 10 minutes. Like I said before, it's just something else is coming down the pipeline here. But I feel like that critical thinking comes from us observing other generations, and even observing people within our generation too, and seeing the harm that can come from that.
So for me, I have always been really interested in politics. My family comes from a political background, and I've always been really interested in news sources. But I think for me, critical thinking also comes from social media, because I can discuss it with people who don't even care about politics, because they know something about politics because they read it on social media. So even they might have like a polarized opinion, but I'm always grateful that they have some opinion, because then I can get my opinions challenged or challenge their opinions.
We talked about this in a meeting with some friends that Karl Popper, a philosopher, said many times, in order to have a conversation, there has to be a point of relativity. In other words, you and I can't have a debate if we can't agree on at least this is our reference point. If we're talking, otherwise we're talking like this, right? Have you guys experienced it, or do you have a way of dealing with those people where your reference points are so fluid or not, or they seem non-existent? Like you're trying to have a discussion with a colleague and they won't even agree that 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, that kind of thing that we're seeing in this election. Have you dealt with that, and how do you deal with that with people online or in classrooms or your family even?
I think one of the most important parts of having a conversation is that you have to have, there's some universal truths that you just have to agree on. And if you don't, I feel like that's how we kind of wind up in what the political spectrum has kind of become, where it's like, we're just yelling at each other, and it's like, I'm telling you this, and you're like, that's not true. And I'm telling you this, and you're like, that's not true. Like, we can't have an engaged conversation like that. So, you know, I have run into that in my personal life with my parents, and it's like, it's to the point where I'm like, I'm not gonna talk to you about this, man. Like, some people, like we were saying, like, if your beliefs are hereditary or not. Some people are born with those beliefs and they just never leave them behind. Like, some people you just can't get anywhere with. I think it just depends on who's open for the conversation and who's not.
I feel like people can be really polarized and not hear each other's opinion, and it can happen here in a second if we convert this discussion panel into a debate. So I feel like that is where discussion really helps, where you don't challenge someone indirectly, but just like hear them out and then tell them your opinion, and don't talk with the purpose to prove someone wrong, but to understand them and tell them, hey, I understand you, but this is something that I think too. Do you think we can have a common ground here? And so not debate, but discuss.
I had an experience actually on campus recently at Market Days. There were people from Turning Point USA, and they had a whiteboard that had written, do you believe biological men should be allowed to compete in women's sports? And they were trying to have what they called a conversation about this issue. I started by saying, okay, before, and as we've talked about, in debate, you start by setting basic facts, yeah. And I said, before I can even talk to you about this, I have to say that scientifically, biological man is not a thing. It's biological male. And we can have that conversation, but that has to be defined first. Unfortunately, they were not able to agree to that as being fact. I pulled up World Health Organization's definition of gender. I talked about how I was a biology major, and even within freshman high school level biology, there talks about a difference between gender and sex. They're two separate things. But we couldn't agree on that set of facts. She would not agree with me that gender and sex were different. I pulled up World Health Organization. She said that's controlled by governments. They're wrong, which is not true. And it's not a reliable source. So I said, okay, if as unbiased as a source as World Health Organization can be trusted by you, we can't have a conversation because we don't agree on a set of facts. Now we're just arguing about whether a fact is true or not, and we're not talking about opinion.
Have you guys seen the Jubilee videos where they get them in the circle and they just argue with each other? One would be, he's like, can I talk? Can I talk? Can I talk? And they just keep interrupting him. That's kind of the conversation that she had. I think watching those, it just feels like what debates be like and what any political conversation in this election has felt like. Where it's like, guys, we're not actually talking. We're not talking with the intention of understanding. We're talking with the intention of hearing our own voice.
So one of the things I heard, and I'll preface this by saying that I was a political junkie like Will for many years, and some of the recent elections have turned me off of being a political junkie to the point where I avoid reading some of the news because it causes me anxiety. Does anyone here feel that sense of dread or anxiety from looking at the news? Because we're bombarded with it. It's in our phones, it dings on our phones, it's on our news, it's in the radio. How do you deal with the anxiety that comes with all that information, especially because you are so adept at social media?
So this is very personal for me because I'm a international student. I'm here on a student visa, and hopefully that won't be threatened. I say hopefully with a lot of quotes. But my parents are here on a visa that already had some problems, so to say, during COVID. So for me, this election, with all the talk about immigrants and how there will be massive deportations, I'm very scared about my parents' status. So of course that gives me a lot of anxiety. But the way I deal with it is kind of looking at the other side of the political spectrum, so to say, and how there's still hope that a candidate may win that won't take those approaches to immigration. It's not a great way to calm your anxiety because of how contested this election is. I can't be like, oh yeah, they're never gonna win, that's never going to happen. But I think that's the best resource that I've got now.
I definitely feel that Gen Z certainly has a tendency to want to be so active on all the issues, and as someone who reads the news quite constantly, you know, I'm kind of guilty as charged with that as well. But I feel like we should allow ourselves the opportunity to step back from the news, step back from, there's obviously these issues are very contentious, and this election has felt like it's been so incredibly long. And I feel like we need to allow ourselves the opportunity to step back and say, hey, obviously these issues are important, and not to be disengaged, but to kind of step back and kind of say to yourself that, politics is important, but it is not the end all be all of our existence. Obviously elections can change the nature of countries, but really those elections are influenced by people and by cultures. So I think those ultimately, and at the end of the day, keep me more concerned is when we have culture shifts, when we have shifts in the discourse as well. But yeah, I'm going to be honest, it's really tough to tune out sometimes because you really don't want to.
I feel like, there's so much news, but I really feel excited and hopeful about it because now we're in this together. Because if there's something happening in one corner of the world, we are all together to help them. And I'm from India, and when something happens in India, I can know about it in seconds. And so if anything, it has just added more hope and excitement for me that I can help my people, even though I'm so far from them.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of when we're looking at all this news, you kind of feel this dread. But I think it comes from a source of hey, we like to have agency in our own life. We like to think that we have a lot of control. And when you're really passionate about all these issues, and you're bombarded with so much news all the time about all these issues you're really passionate about, you gotta realize that you can do what you can in politics. You can go vote, you can advocate for your causes, but there's a certain limit that we can have on the effects of like the politics around us, the political sphere. And I think that you should just be careful not to have the weight of the world on your shoulders all the time.
Yeah, definitely. It can be a lot to take in. All the time. Up until this panel, I haven't really been much of a political person. Like, I come from a news-off household. Like, unless there's a hurricane coming, the news will not be on. Like, I open New York Times to play Wordle and I close it. But I just think now, moving into this new position, becoming an adult, this is the election that will determine the climate of my young adult life, and I have had to tune into some things a little bit. I feel like just constantly taking it all in and just get really overwhelming, but just knowing the baseline issues, what you need to know to vote, the amendments, all of that. I feel like just making it selective is what's important.
I resonate a lot with one of the things that David said, that something that can calm that anxiety is like go out there and do what you can, but understanding that you can't do everything. So voting or being a volunteer for a candidate that holds the same views as you, voting in local elections, caring about what happens at the local level, which is where we have the most voice in. I think it's a great source to be like funnel that anxiety away.
Yeah, it's very overwhelming. Guys, like counseling center, you can go for free. It's really great. Yeah, it's a lot.
Can faculty go?
Yeah. It's a lot. It's hard, and for me, what I care about, what I've always cared about the most when it comes to politics is human rights, and when I feel that those are being infringed upon. And that is really heavy. If economic policies here and there don't go the way you want them to go, it's not as heavy as, oh, my rights were just taken away. That's really great. Or seeing the conflict, or I should really say genocide, going on in Gaza, and having people from every side of the political spectrum, both candidates that we have under the two-party system, supporting Israel, and supporting the killing of innocent people. And watching that and feeling powerless, especially under the two-party system, to do anything about it, and not having the funding to donate to people. It's really difficult, and like I said, you do what you can, you take the steps you can, and that's really all you can do, and like David said, try not to have the weight of the world on your shoulders.
So I have one more question before we open it up for others. That is, you mentioned it, we have a two-party system. Many of us in this room have heard, and we've heard it in our schools, our churches, everywhere else, America is the greatest political system in the world. How do you feel about that notion that we're the greatest country, and we're also the greatest political system in the world? Do you think that that is true? Do you think that's untrue? Do you think there needs to be more nuance, etc.?
Short answer, no. Long answer. I believe that a country that calls itself the free world should take more into account the voices of more than just 7 states when choosing who's gonna lead them. So no, I don't think that the current system to pick our public officers is right or beneficial for most. And I feel like there are so many other ways to get even just a little bit more representation in politics that could be implemented, such as So I forgot the name of this, but at least in Colombia, this is how it works. Where, for example, in the Senate, proportional representation, that's what they. So there are multiple parties, and then you can vote for the different parties, and each party gets a number of seats that is proportional to the votes that they got, and that way we can. And we also have a set number of seats for minorities, so that everyone's voice is heard. And the system in Colombia and proportional representation is far from being perfect, but I believe that it would give a voice to way more people than the system that we have right now.
Maybe I think greatness has become a charged word in the last few years here, but I feel that perhaps maybe political system is not the right word here, but maybe political experiment. There's truly some very, as the political scientist junkie that I am, there's pretty innovative things that we have in the Constitution, and right, not perfect whatsoever by any means, but I think Winston Churchill said it best that, democracy is not perfect, but it's the best thing that we've got. So I feel that maybe this is going to change or not change, but we've really created an environment where we can talk about these issues and experiment with them on all levels, whether we're looking at the local level, state, federal, whatever it would be. So though it is messy and not perfect and very contentious, I think that's kind of the nature of the game that we call democracy.
I also feel, circling back to your first question, what makes this election special? Maybe it's that America has been great, but now the question is, how do you uphold that greatness? And I feel like it is through giving everyone equal opportunity, because for me, what attracted me towards the US is I feel it's a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship, and so having those businesses, giving those businesses equal opportunities, I think that's really important to uphold that greatness.
Okay, so I think that you had said the two-party system and kind of how it can be great, or if it's great still. And I think that often it's sad. I was talking with my friend just last night about this, and kind of we get a binary, red or blue, but then he said, my main problem why I'm not going to vote this year, a lot of people in Alabama don't vote because your vote is worth nothing, is there's no spectrum here. You get to pick one side or the other, but you don't actually get to pick up and down, like whether you pick somebody who's authoritarian or libertarian, that the party kind of chooses for you. And sometimes we talk about the binary, but in Alabama, in my ballot, I have 24 elections going on, and out of that, 20 of them are uncontested. So I don't even have a binary there. I might be able to write a mixed segment or something, but unfortunately, I think that that's not the right system to go for. It's very sad as somebody living in a place where one party dominates.
Yeah, definitely. I think for the last two solid elections, it's kind of moved away from, okay, these are your two options, to pick the least worst option out of these two. And it's not really, I feel like it's taking away some of the focus away from policy, what could make America the great thing it was promised to be. It's kind of just like what will keep America from caving in on itself a little bit.
Okay, they're going to come up in just a few words. I want you to say, what makes you optimistic about our political experience?
Gen Z makes me very optimistic.
Great.
I think this panel discussion tonight, where we have so many voices and we're all engaging with them together, it makes me hopeful that we keep doing it and we have more voices.
I think that the diversity of opinions and the strengthening of kind of my own ideas through higher education really strengthen my resolve and my opinion that everybody can do that everybody can have strengthening their ideas all the time.
I think the amount of people I know my age who are voting is really inspiring. It's a really great thing to see. There's often obstacles in the way of younger people voting, and yet a lot of young people are voting. Also, that I'm seeing, at least from the people around me, that people aren't always idealizing political candidates. That there's a difference between casting your vote for somebody and fully supporting and endorsing somebody, and that people are starting to be able to see that dichotomy, and that's not always black and white, that I've seen a lot of people saying, you know, that support Kamala Harris. Hope you get in. You're going to have a lot of work to do and a lot to answer for once you are. And I think that's a great perspective, and that gives me a lot of hope.
The accessibility of information, because even though it can be sobering at times, knowledge is power. It's really all we can hope for right now is to just have that information in the right hands at the right time.
That communication is improving, empathy is on the rise, and young leaders know what they want and are taking the steps to achieve it.
I will close by saying, working with people of your generation and you, some of my students, it gives me a lot of optimism. You'll hear, there's a song I like that says, every generation blames the one that comes before and after. Your generation is more politically astute, more informed than probably any generation of the past. And it gives me hope because I see in my students a focus on equity and a focus on justice. And I think that really speaks well for the future. So thank you all for that. And thank all of you guys for being here and being